Okay, welcome to this video. In this video, we're going to use Xcode and we're going to use Objective-C in order to create a currency conversion app that we can run on an iPhone or an iPad. We'll go through all the steps that are required along the way to do that. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to need to create a design for what we want. And so basically, the high-level gist of what we're going to create is something that looks a little bit like this. It's going to be a single view application with a segment controller. And the segment controller is going to allow you to switch between different currency conversions. And we'll have a text field at the top of our view that enables us to enter in dollars. And those dollars will be converted in real time as you type or as you switch the segment controllers. All right, so the steps we're going to walk through in order to do this are: first, we're going to make our project. Then we're going to allow our app to get web data. Then we're going to build the interface that we need in order to make this work. We're going to declare our UI fields as variables and bind them to those variables. We're going to make our buttons responsive, or rather, we're going to make our elements interactive. We're going to pick the currencies that we want to convert from. We're going to make the CR currency request object, which is provided by a CocoaPod we're going to install. We'll make a delegate function, so after we go out and request the conversion rates, we'll get a callback within our application saying those are ready to go. And then finally, we'll make sure that it all works. Okay, so let's go ahead and make the project. We're going to do that. Here's a terminal window, but actually what we're going to do is we're going to close that for a second, and we're going to go ahead and go to Xcode, and we are going to, under the menu bar, we're going to create a new project. Normal way that you would create a project. And we are going to wait for the wizard to come up. We're going to select iOS because we're making an iOS app. And here we're going to select our single view application and then select next. Go ahead and give it a name, whatever we want. Currency conversion app. And in this case, we're going to make sure that it says Objective-C because that's the language we're going to be using for this one, and universal, so it'll run on an iPad or an iPhone. We don't need any of these checkboxes checked off because of what we're going to do in this application. And then our organization identifier is going to be very simple because I'm not planning on submitting this to the iTunes store. Go ahead and select next and decide where you're going to store it in your on your hard drive. And when you've picked a spot on your hard drive, go ahead and hit create. Now it's important that when you pick that spot on your hard drive, you remember where it is, because the first thing that we do after our application is built by Xcode, and once all the files are done being indexed and processed, as we can see up here in the status bar, is we're going to close Xcode and we're going to make our project CocoaPods aware. We're going to convert the XC project directory into an XC workspace directory, or we'll have one paired with that, so that we can use the third-party library CR currency request, which is what we're interested in using to get our real-time currency conversion data. Okay, so I'm going to quit Xcode, and I'm going to bring back up my terminal application, and I'm going to look at where I am, and I'm going to go into my currency conversion app, which I just created. So if you are in the right spot on your hard drive and you hit LS, then you should see two files that look like this, although they'll have the names that you pick. All right, so you have to make sure that you have CocoaPods installed on your system, and if that's not true, you have to run sudo gem install CocoaPods, and that'll ask for your password. And if you haven't had it installed, it'll take a little while longer than this to install, but if it is installed, then it'll just take a second here. We'll just let it go through, make sure everything's up to date. And if it is, then nothing will have changed in our directory. And then what we want to do is we want to type pod init. And that's going to create an environment in which we can install CocoaPods. So we'll do that. And if everything goes okay, when we type ls, we will see that we have a new file here, which is pod file. Now now what I need to do is I need to edit pod file. So if I do open period, that will open a Finder window in my current directory. And from there, I can edit it with any text editor that I might have. And I can right-click on it and open or open with, whatever I think is appropriate. I'm just going to go ahead and use a text editor called Vim, and I'm going to open the pod file. Give it a second to open up. Great. Okay, now the thing that we need to do to this file is in between target and end, we need to add the line, 2 spaces, I put 2 spaces, pod, space, single quote, currency with a capital C, no space, request, capital R, single quote. You can get rid of all the other comments if you want for now, and then save that file. And after we save that file, I'm going to close my Finder window. We'll go back to our terminal application. Give my window a second here to stabilize. I'll clear the window, and then we look and see what we've got. We've got our pod file. If I type more on my pod file, I can see that I have those changes made in that file. And now I'll type pod install. What this command is going to do is it's going to go out to the internet and it's going to install all the CocoaPods that are referenced in my pod file. And in this case, the only one that I am requesting is the currency request object. So it'll take a second to go get it, and then it's going to generate a version of my Xcode project that ends with the XC workspace extension. And that's actually the one that I want to open from here on out. So if you look here, you see that there's now Xcode project and Xcode workspace. And what I want to do is I want to open the XC workspace in Xcode. So if I can do that from the command line, or I can do it from my Finder window, right click and make sure that I open that with Xcode. Give it a second to launch. And I'm going to go ahead and hide my terminal window and hide my Finder window because I'm not going to need those right away. If all goes well, your Xcode project is going to reopen, and what you're going to find is you're going to find that your project, after it finishes indexing the files, will now have a directory over here called pods, and that's the file that we're going to leverage as our third-party library. Okay, so that was making our project. And now what we need to do is we need to allow our project, so this was making our project. We did a single view application, we made it CocoaPods aware, and we included currency request as a CocoaPod. Now what we need to do is we need to allow our app to get web data. The resource that currency request uses is a web-based resource provided by the European Central Bank that contains real-time currency conversion rates. The European Central Bank, the web page that we access, or the data that we access, we're going to access with HTTP protocol. In order to access data with the HTTP protocol, we have to turn off application transport security within our application. And we do that within the info.plist file. So let's do that next. So we're going to go into our project and we're going to look at the place where our code is located. I'm going to go ahead and click on storyboard just to show you that we've got a storyboard ready. But what we're going to edit is info.plist. Info.plist is a collection of information that's used by the operating system on an iOS device to understand how this program, what resources this program is going to need and how it's described. It's like a manifest file. So in the white space, I'm going to right-click and select Show Raw Keys and Values. What that's going to do is it's going to convert these names into the formal, the computer-friendly version of them. And then I'm going to add a new one by right-clicking and selecting Add Row. And I'm going to select NS App Transport Security and hit Return. That's going to add a new key to my info.plist file. I'm going to hit the little triangle next to it to open it up, although it has no children. And once it's open, I'm going to select the plus button here to add a subkey. And that's going to be NS allows arbitrary loads. Hit Tab and then go over to the next field and hit Yes. And by doing this, what we're doing is we're asking the iOS device to allow this application to connect to web resources using an insecure protocol. So connections between us and the European Central Bank are unencrypted and can be snooped on by anyone that's on the internet in between us and the destination. Now in this case, we're just requesting publicly available information, so I'm not particularly concerned about that. Okay, so that is allowing our application to get web data. We've altered info.plist and 2 keys there. We've added 2 keys. The next thing that we want to do is we want to build the interface. All right, so let's do that. Let's start by going to our launch screen storyboard and just giving ourselves a launch screen for whatever it is we want to see when we're loading the rest of the application. And for the time being, I'm just going to put a label out here so that I know we're launching, and I will just make it say launching the launching currency conversion. Gotta spell it right. Conversion app. Okay, and I want to make the font a little bit bigger. I'll make it maybe 24. And now I need to put some constraints on it so it shows up in the right place. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to make sure that the edges are within 0 on the right and left. So that's going to stretch out the box to the left and right, making sure both these things are red, and then adding 2 constraints. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that this is going to be in the center of the screen vertically. So I'm going to select vertically in the container and add 1 constraint. And I see that maybe the font is a little bit too big in general, so I'm going to go ahead and select automatically adjust font, but I'm going to make it a little bit smaller so that we can see the whole frame in there. Good, done. And then I'm going to text justify it to the center so that it is centered within its box. Okay, looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and run the simulator to make sure that my launch screen worked okay. And it's going to take a second for my simulator to launch. I'm going to run it on an iPhone 7 Plus. Okay, and there's our splash screen, and it looks good as it's loading. And then we have a blank screen to start with. So that's great. So let's go back to Xcode, and we'll hit stop. And then we need to continue building our user interface. So our main view is going to be in main storyboard, and we'll go there. And we will just zoom in a little bit so we can get a better view. And what we'll do is at the top, I'm going to put something that just says what this is. And so this is the currency conversion tool. I'll just make it say that. And we'll make it a little bit bigger. I think, what did we end up with on the other one? 24 maybe? Good. And oops, not 2. 24. There we go. Now we're going to anchor this in the center of our view, stretch it out left and right, and then attach it to the top. So I'm going to put some constraints on it again, and I'm going to have it be, let's see if I can get some response here on my computer. All right, I'm going to use the standard value from the top, so whatever that is, and I'm going to use 0 from the left. That'll let me type that in. 0, great. And then 0 on the right. Those are 3 constraints that should put it in the center top of my view. I'll add those constraints, and that centers the box in the top of my view. Now I want, within the box, I want to center the text. So I'm going to hit center justify. Great, so that's my currency conversion, sort of a descriptor. Now I'm going to put a place where the user can type something in. And so that's going to be a text field. And there's my text field. I'm going to put it roughly where I want it to be. Right about there. And next to it, I'm going to put a $sign as a label so that it's clear that what I intend for people to do is enter US dollars. So I'm going to put a label to the left here. And within the label, I'm going to put a $sign. And now I just need to lay these out so it works correctly. So what I want this to do is I want the $sign to be anchored to the left and to the top. And the width will be just the width of the text that's in there. That should work okay. So we'll use a standard distance from the currency conversion object that's above it, standard value. And then we'll use 0 things to anchor it to the left side. And we'll add those constraints. And that'll shift it over to the right. And then with our text field, we're going to want to anchor that in the same way as standard distance from the top, and then a width to the left and the right. So select the standard value, which is a little bit of a margin that's built into the theme for whatever standard set of parameters I have for like a theme for this app. All right, so that anchors it on the left, right, and top, and I'll add those constraints. Great. And then actually, I think I want to correct that because I don't want it hugging quite so much up to the left there. Let's see, what do I want to do? I'm going to give it a little bit more space. So I'm going to open that constraint, and I'm going to say the text field leading, nope, that's going to be the wrong field. Let's see. That's the top. That's the left. All right, so I'll tell you what, I'm just going to clear all the constraints on that field so I make sure I get the right one. Come down here and hit the little yield button, and I'm going to clear the constraints on the selected view. And then I'm going to try them again, and I'm going to have it be the standard value from the top. And on the left side, I'm going to use the standard value, which will give it a little bit of a margin on the left. And on the right, I'll have it be 0. So add those 3 constraints. There we go. That gives me a little bit of space between the $ and the text field. Now I'm going to select the text field, and I'm going to control drag that over to the $, and I'm going to ask to center those 2 things vertically. And that way I will have them lined up pretty well. And the other thing I want to do is I want to specify that I want the width of the text field to be, I don't know, maybe 90% of the view. So I'm going to control drag the text field and connect it to the view. And I'm going to start by saying equal widths. I'm going to watch over on the left which constraint gets added. See that, I think it was this one here. Yeah, there we go. And so this is a constraint that is connecting the text field to the width of the view in which it's installed. And I don't actually want it to be the same. I want it to be equal to 90% of the view. So I'm going to make that 0.9 if it'll let me. Let's see. I want it to be 0.9. There we go. So the text field will take up 90% of the width. Now I've got some, I want to make sure that everything's laid out the way I expect it to be, and so I'm going to go under Resolve Auto Layout Issues, and under, I can see that my Update Frames has been grayed out, and so everything is laying out the way I would expect it to be laid out in the actual application. Okay, so far so good. I've laid out my different fields there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a segmented controller below it. And that's going to be how we select the currency that we want. I'm going to drop that in there. Good. And now I actually want 3 different currencies present. And so I'm going to, with the segmented controller selected, I'm going to come over here on the right, and I'm going to select Properties, and I'm going to find the spot where it says how many different segments are there. And you can see right here, segments is listed as 2. I'm going to up that to 3. And now I'm going to stretch that out the width of my device by adding constraints. And again, I'm going to anchor it a standard width from the top element that's above it. And on the left, I'm going to stretch it out to all the way to the margin and all the way to the margin on the right. I'm going to add those 3 constraints and stretch it out. And now I've got 3 bits here. I'm going to select my segmented controller, and to give some text in the 3rd segment that I just added, I'm going to switch the segment down to segment 012, which is the 3rd segment. I'll just give it some temporary text for the time being, make it say test. All right, and then the last thing that I need is I need a place to put my answer. So I'm going to create a label that's going to contain my answer. And I'll put my label here. Great. And I'm going to constrain it. I'm going to make it go left, right, and top again. And so I will anchor it a standard distance from the element above it. And then I will make it go all the way to the left and all the way to the right, add those 3 constraints. And then within the box itself, I'm going to center justify all the text. All right, so if all goes well, then if we run this, we should see everything get laid out correctly. So I'm going to run it and just make sure that in the simulator, all my constraints look like they're doing the right thing. Okay, we're launching our currency conversion app. And then it looks like everything looks great. So I can enter text in here, I think. There we go. Oh, actually, I can't see my $. That's a problem. Let's go back and fix that a little bit. I'm not sure where the $sign went, but fair enough. We'll go back and fix it. I'll stop the simulator running. And let's see, where did this guy end up? He must have gotten squished out. So let's clear the constraints on him by selecting the object and then coming down here and clearing the constraints on the selected view. And now I'm going to go ahead and make him a standard width from the top, and then 0 from the left, add those constraints. So that'll anchor them to the left and right. And then, oh, actually I'm going to undo that. I'm going to clear those constraints, and I'm going to anchor him to the left with one constraint. And then I'm going to control drag this element, oops, undo that. I'm going to control drag the $ to the text field, and I'm going to have them be centered vertically. Good. And now it still feels a little bit like he's getting shrunk, so I'm going to go ahead and change the constraint on the right side for being 90%. Let's find that constraint. There, I'm going to make this not be 90% of the screen, but let's make it be 75% of the screen. And maybe that'll give a little bit more space for my label to be in here. All right. Let's run that and see how that looks. Okay, launching our currency conversion app. Now we've got our $, and we have our text field. That looks a lot better. Okay. So let's put some prompt text in our label before we get too far. I'm going to select my text label here, and I'm going to put some text in it, and I'm going to say enter an amount in US dollars. Great. Actually that's the actual text. I don't want it there. I want to put it in the placeholder text so it goes away after it's entered. That's good. And I also want it to be left justified so it lines up with that $. And then I'm going to select the $, and I'm actually going to have the $, be right justified in hopes that it will line up with the text field. I'm going to add one more constraint to it. I'm going to make it line up to the right 0 to try and move that over. There we go. That's kind of what I was looking for, lining up the $ to the edge of that field. Okay, and then in this label, rather than having the word label show up when we first connect, I'm going to put some temporary text in here that says connecting to the internet. We'll show that text until the point at which we get our conversion rates back. All right, let's do one more run before we move on to our next step. Okay, launching our currency conversion app. Connecting to the internet. Okay, that looks much better. I'm happier with that now. Okay, so let's go back, stop the simulator, and let's go back to our next step. So what we did is we just built our interface. That went pretty well. Now what we need to do is we need to bind the UI fields to variables so that we can access them. And that's going to require starting to edit some code. So let's do that as our next step. To do that, I'm going to select the editor assistant to get some text on the side. I'll try and center the storyboard here, and I'll get rid of the Explorer on the right so we have a little bit more screen real estate. On the right side, I'm going to have the viewController.h show up, and the way that I decide which UI fields I want bound to variables has to do with whether or not I need access to the information when I'm running it. So I know that I'm going to need to be able to read the amount of dollars that the user wants to convert. So I'm going to need to get the text field bound to a variable. I'm going to need to know which currency to convert to. So I'm going to need to select the segmented controller. And then I'm going to need to change the text that's in the field that says connecting to the internet. And so I'm going to need to bind those three variables. So let's start by selecting the text field. And I'm going to control drag that from the left side all the way over to my code. And it's going to make a property for me. And I need to name it. And we'll call that the input value. Great. And then I'm also going to need to connect to the segmented controller. So I'm going to control drag that all the way over to my field on the right. And I'm going to call that my segmented controller. And you can see the little circles are filled in, and that means that they're bound to variables. And the last thing that I want to do is I want to drag my text field over so that I can put the answer in that field when I'm ready to go. And so we'll call that the output value. And we'll connect. All right, so that's all clean. Okay, so we've bound those fields to our variables. That was relatively easy. The next thing that we want to do is we want to make our fields interactive. So we're just going to put some basic structure into our code so that we know that the different fields are being that we have access to them, and that we're getting callback functions from them before we try and do any of the currency work. So let's do that next. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my .m field. Actually, I'll put that down below here. And I've got my .m file below. And now I'm going to select the things that I want callbacks for on the left and drag and drop them to my .m file. So I'm going to want a callback whenever the user enters something into my field, into my number field. So I'm going to control drag that over to my .m file, and I'll insert an action. And I'm going to say edit, I'm going to say input changed. Now I have to be careful because in addition to giving the variable name here, I need to select a different event. And the event is going to be that editing changed, and that means that at any time when the user changes something in that field, I want to be told. And so I'm going to set that event, and then I'm going to connect to that action. So I'll get a callback whenever the user enters something in that field. The next thing I want to call back for is whenever the segment controller changes so that I can update the currency there. So I'm going to control drag that element over to my .m file as well. And I'm going to call that segment controller changed. And also I'm going to make sure that my event is correct here. And in this case, value changed is the default, and that's what I want. So I'm going to connect it. Okay, so far so good. I now have those two things happening. Now I actually want to see something change when I enter things in. And so whenever either things happen, I'm going to update what the answer field says. And so this is just for testing to make sure everything's wired right. So in input changed, whenever someone types something into the input, I'm going to say self.output field, output value, .text, and I'm going to set that equal to a string, NS string. I'm going to build that with a format, and the format is going to be actually I don't even need a format for this one, because what I'll do is I'll just take the value from the input field directly. So input value.text. So as people type, I'm just going to move that text down into the connecting to the internet value directly. And when the segment controller changed, we'll read and we'll see what the segment controller's value is. So if self.segment controller dot selected segment index equals 0, so if it's the first one, then we'll say self.output value dot text equals string, I'll say first one. And then if it's not equal to 1, if it's not equal to 0, if instead it's equal to 1, then instead of saying first one, we'll say second one. And then if it is equal to 2, we will say third one. And then if it's equal to anything else, which it never should be, we'll just go ahead and put an error message in there. All right, now when we run it, we should get a little bit of we should have some confidence that we've connected our different input elements, our UI elements, to variables, and that we've gotten the callbacks correctly. And we'll just see that we're editing the way that we expect it to edit, except for the fact that we won't be converting anything into currency values. So I'm going to run it. We've already validated that the UI is laid out right, and so now we're just checking the interactivity before we actually add the functionality to it. Okay, and we're launching. And now if I type into the input box, I type hello world, you can see that the callback function, whenever I edit this field, is being called, and I'm moving the value of the input field into the output field. Likewise, if I select the different segments on my segment controller, I update that field as well. And then if I keep typing, it updates this field. So far so good. That's great. All right, so we made the fields interactive. Now let's go pick the currencies that we're going to want to use in our application. And to do that, we have to know what currencies are provided by the currency request object. So we're going to look in the code for that. So we're going to go back into our Explorer, and we are going to get rid of the assistant, and we will select under pods. We'll go under pods and currency request. We'll just look at the currency request.h object and see if we can find where those currencies are listed. There's our .m, currency results.h. There we go. So here's a list of all the different currencies that we can get. We'll remember these. But I think the one that I want to grab is I'm going to want to grab the euro, the yen, and maybe the Great British pound. That sounds good to me. So to set that up, I'm going to go back to my segmented controller, and I'm going to change the text in the segmented controller to reflect that. So meanwhile, back in my storyboard, I'm going to select my segmented controller, and I'm going to select segment, the first segment, and I'm going to change the text that is there to say yen, and just so that we look like we're all international, I'm going to go ahead and throw the international character, or not the international character, the Unicode character for yen in there by bringing up my keyboard controller from the Mac operating system. So if I go to frequently used, because I happen to have used it recently, I'll click yen. That will insert the yen into my box. I will hit tab to anchor it. You can see it changes right here. And now we'll change the second element, and I will make the second element be equal to euro, give it a space, and then I'll do the same thing. I'll select the euro element, and then hit tab to make sure it takes. And then in the third one, I will say the pound. And I will add the pound symbol there. And then hit tab to make sure it takes. Great. And so now my user interface has 3 different currencies associated with it. So I picked my currencies from the currency request object, and I made them and I updated them in the segment controller. All right, now we're going to add the part that's the most code heavy, which is where we're going to go out and we're going to connect our application to the internet. So to do that, we're going to need to make a currency request object. And this request object is going to be used to capture the results of the current currency valuations. We're going to need to import 2 files, the request and the results header file. And we're going to need to add the CR currency request delegate as an interface to our view controller so that we know that our class implements a delegate function. And we'll use alloc and init to create a new request object. So let's do that. All right, so now we're going to bring back up our assistant, and we'll make our Explorer go away a little bit. And let's see, what do we get here? I think we can make this go away, and we'll switch to our .m file. In our view did load function, so one time after we create our object, we're going to get every time we run our object and every time we run our application, we'll get the currency exchange results one time. And so we'll do that triggered on the view did load callback. And so up here in our import section, we're going to go ahead and import CR currency, or not CR currency request, just currency request / CR currency request.h. And in addition to the request, we're going to want the results.h. Great. And then in our interface in our view controller, and not here, but in our actually, let's see, let's copy this because we're going to want to put that in our .m and our .h file. Actually, you know what? We just need it in our .h file. I made a mistake. Let's take it from our .m file and go to our .h file because our .h file is imported from our .m file. So now we're in our .h file, and we can go ahead and include those elements here. Now we're going to manually add an object to our class. We're going to add an element which is going to capture our currency request and our currency results. So let's go ahead and manually add a property. And it'll be non-atomic. And what is its type going to be? Well, it's going to be a CR currency request object, and we'll call it REQ. And we're also going to add an object which is going to be the result. So property non-atomic CR currency results. There we go. And we will call those the results. Those are going to be two objects that the first one is going to be our request for them, and the second one is going to be the results that we get back. All right, so that's in our .h file. Now we can switch to our .m file. And in our view did load, we're going to go ahead and instantiate one of those objects. We'll create it. And so we'll say our self.req, that's the object that we've declared, is going to equal, using our receiver selector syntax, a CR currency request object. First we'll allocate memory for it, and then we're going to initialize it by calling its constructor. Once we have created it, we're going to need to create a delegate. So let's talk about that for a second. The way our currency object works is that when we ask it to, it's going to go out to the internet and get the result. It's going to get the current currency exchange rates. We don't know how long that's going to take because the network can be variable and latent. We can have it take a lot of time or a little bit of time. It's an asynchronous request. And so we're going to have to create a method within our class that will be responsible for updating our object when the results do come back. All right, so that means that in the beginning when our app loads, we don't have the conversion rates, and we're going to want to make sure that the user can't do anything until we get those results back. So what the way the delegate works is that our CR currency request object within it has an instance variable called the delegate. And the delegate is what is called after it gets an answer back. Unless we tell the CR currency request object that we want to handle that delegate response, it's not going to tell us when it gets an answer back. So we need to specifically set the delegate within the object to be our object. We can only do that if we implement the correct interface. The interface says, if we implement the interface, that's a way of telling the compiler that we actually have the method that's required by the delegate to be called when the currency request comes back. So it's going to be a two-step process. We're going to declare that we're implementing the interface, and then we're actually going to we're actually going to implement the interface as well. All right, so let's do that. Let's try and connect it all. All right, so we said that until we get the results back, we don't want anyone to be able to enter anything into our text field. So let's just add that user interface element and make that work okay. So what we'll do is we'll say self.inputValue.enabled equals no. That'll mean that someone can't type anything in to our input field until we get the currency request results back. And that's okay because our label says connecting to the internet when it first loads. All right, so after we have created our object, now we need to set our delegate. So we're going to say self.rec.delegate. We want that to be equal to this object. Now, Xcode is going to complain here because our object doesn't implement the correct interface. It should say as much here. Yeah, it says assigning ourself to the delegate field doesn't work because we don't have the correct type. So to have the correct type, we need to come up here to where it says interface and say, oh, you know what? Our object actually does do the right thing. We implement the CR currency request delegate methods. When we enter that, now Xcode's going to complain because it says, wait a second, you say you're implementing that delegate method, but I don't actually see it anywhere here. So it says method currency request in protocol not implemented. All right, so let's go ahead and implement the callback function that we need when we get the callback. So that's going to be, Xcode's going to try and fill it out for us, but it has a void return value, and it's called currency request, and there's Xcode filling it in. So I'm going to hit enter, and you will see that this is the method that gets called back when we have received our results back from our object. request to get the conversion rates. At the moment at which we have successfully gotten the conversion rates back, we want to do two things. We want to store them. So we're going to want to do something like, say, self.results. So the object that we're keeping track of is going to be equal to the results that we just got back from our callback. So our callback is going to pass us a parameter, which is going to be the results, and we're going to keep track of them. And why didn't that work? All right, because I spelled it wrong. That's why. All right, and once we have results, we also want to allow the user to enter things into the text field. So we'll say enabled equals yes. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to get rid of that phrase that says connecting to the internet. We want to say self.outputValue.text equals some string that indicates that we're ready to go. And just for fun, I'm going to go ahead and put in an emoji there as well. We'll put in a little globe indicating that we're ready to read things from the internet, from the world, I guess. Okay. So our delegate is set up. And the last thing that we need to do when we load up our application is so let's just walk through the steps here. When our application starts, we disable the input field. We create a request object. We set the delegate of the request object to be ourself. So when the response comes back from requesting information from the internet, we'll get told. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to initiate the request from the internet. So we'll say self.req start. And that's the way that we launch this CocoaPod. Then clean this up. All right, then we'll return from the viewDidLoad function, and when this method gets the results, the currency request object will be invoked. We will capture those currencies, and we will set the field equal to yes, and then we will enable our output field. So if we run it right now, we should see that process happen. So let's go ahead and run it. And we're launching our currency conversion app. And very quickly, we should see the text get replaced. There we go. Very quickly, we connected to the internet. We got our results back, and now we're ready to go. Now, we're not doing the conversion yet. We've still got our old code in here. So if we type something into our field, select the field. There we go. We replaced our dollar with what we had. All right, so let's stop that. Now let's add our final functionality. So what we need to make sure that we do is we need to make sure that whenever someone enters something into the text field, or whenever we select the segmented controller, we update that answer label. So let's create a helper function along the way that's going to do that. And we'll call that dash void. And we will say that method is just going to be update label once my keyboard catches up. And it will take no parameters, but what I will do is I will take this text here that I was switching based on the segmented controller, and I will put that in my update label instead. And in my segment controller, whenever someone changes the controller, we're going to call self update label. And whenever our input changes, we're going to call self.updateLabel. And now we need to make sure that this is declared in our .h file so that we don't run into any trouble with it being visible. This is going to be a method that is present within our object. So we'll declare that here. Make sure that we end it with a semicolon. Okay, then go back to our .m file. So what we need to do is we need to get the amount of money that is currently in our text field. So we'll say input dollars, and that's going to be equal to self.inputValue.text and text, and it's going to be the I guess it's going to be the float value of that input field. Actually, is there a double value? Let's see if we can get double value. All right, great. And so that's our input dollars. And so now if we are in our first segment, if our first segment is selected, then we want to convert that to yen. And so we're going to say double yen value is going to equal input dollars times our results object. And the element that we're going to access in there is our yen conversion rate. And then we just need to construct a string that is going to be, well, let's just do it directly. That will set our output value to, our output text to. All right, so our string will need to be a receiver selector syntax. So we'll pass to our NSString class the string with format selector. The parameter we will pass it will first be a format string, and we will want to put into that format string the yen symbol, and then that will be followed by a float value, and that float value is going to be filled in with the yen value. So we use this in the printf style of command. So let me stretch that out so we see that. Okay? All right, now if we're in number 1, we want to convert it to euro instead. So we're going to replace this with euro value, and we're not going to use the JPY exchange rate. We'll use the euro exchange rate. And then we will build the euro value here, and the actual character we put in there, we'll put a euro symbol in there. Right, and then finally we want to do the same thing, but we want to do it with the pound. And the pound, and not the euro symbol, but the pound symbol. All right, and now that should be everything. So if we run it, we have our launching currency conversion app splash window. While it loads the program into memory, we'll see that it's going to, very quickly went to the internet to get the information that we wanted. We can enter an amount in US dollars once we're allowed to. Let's bring up the keyboard to do that actually, just as if a user was typing it. So I hit Command K to do that, and then select the money symbol, or the digits keyboard, and do 1, 0, dot, 0, 0, and you can see that the yen value is being updated very quickly. And I can switch to euro, and euro will be updated, and then pound will be updated. And if I change this to be 100, or I change it to be 50, I really quickly get a nice response, albeit it's running in a simulator. So that's basically it. We created a currency application that worked in real time, and I guess basically we can celebrate now. How did we do that? Well, we used a CocoaPod. We disabled app transport security so we could access an unsecured resource on the internet at the European Central Bank. We built an interface and we bound it to variables. Then we added a delegate function so when we got our information back, our app would work correctly. And then we just made the plumbing work so that we updated our label with the correct value when we selected the appropriate elements. So if you're following along and building your own, good luck. Hope you have success in making your currency conversion app. Thank you very much.